The oldest building in Heraklion will outlive the newest building in America. Organisms die. The cell lives on. Life is at the roots, embedded in simplicity, asserting itself uniquely. I called regularly at the vice consul's home for my bowl of rice. Sometimes he had visitors. One evening, the head of the Merchant Tailors Association dropped in. He had lived in America and spoke a quaint, old-fashioned English. "Gentlemen, will you have a cigar?" he would say. I told him I had been a tailor myself once upon a time. "But he's a journalist now," the vice consul hastily put in. "He's just read my book." I began to talk about alpaca sleeve linings, basting, soft roll lapels, beautiful vicunas, flap pockets, silk vests, and braided cutaways. I talked about these things madly for fear the vice consul would divert the conversation to his pet obsession. I wasn't quite sure whether the boss tailor had come as a friend or as a favored menial. I didn't care. I decided to make a friend of him, if only to keep the conversation off that infernal book which I had pretended to have read, but which I couldn't stomach after page 3. "Where was your shop, gentlemen?" asked the tailor. "On Fifth Avenue," I said. "It was my father's shop." "Fifth Avenue? That's a very rich street, isn't it?" he said, whereupon the vice consul pricked up his ears. "Yes," I said. "We had only the best customers. Nothing but bankers, brokers, lawyers, millionaires, steel and iron magnates, hotel keepers, and so on." "And you learned how to cut and sew?" he said. "I could only cut pants," I answered. "Coats were too complicated." "How much did you charge for a suit, gentlemen?" "Oh, at that time we asked only $100 or $125. He turned to the vice consul to ask him to calculate what that would be in drachmas. They figured it out. The vice consul was visibly impressed. It was a staggering sum in Greek money, enough to buy a small ship. I felt that they were somewhat skeptical. I began talking carload lots about telephone books, skyscrapers, ticket tape, paper napkins, and all the paraphernalia of the big city, which makes the yokel roll his eyes as if he'd seen the Red Sea opening up. The ticker tape arrested the tailor's attention. He had been to Wall Street once to visit the stock exchange. He wanted to speak about it. He asked me diffidently if there weren't men in the street who ran their own little markets. He began making deaf and dumb signs, as they used to do in the curb market. The vice consul looked at him as if he was slightly touched. I came to his rescue. Of course there were such men, thousands of them, all trained in this special deaf and dumb language, I asserted vigorously. I stood up and made a few signs myself to demonstrate how it was done. The vice consul smiled. I said I would take them inside the stock exchange on the floor itself. I described that madhouse in detail, ordering myself slices of anaconda copper, amalgamated tin, tell and tell, anything I could remember of that crazy Wall Street past, whether volatile, combustible, or analgesic. I ran from one corner of the room to the other, buying and selling like a maniac, standing at the vice consul's commode and telephoning my broker to flood the market, calling my banker to make a loan of $50,000 immediately, calling the telegraph jakes to take a string of telegrams, calling the grain and wheat trusters in Chicago to dump a load in the Mississippi, calling the Secretary of the Interior to inquire if he had passed that bill about the Indians, calling my chauffeur to tell him to put a new spare tire on the back behind the rumble seat, calling my shirt maker to curse him for making the neck too tight on the pink and white shirt, and what about my initials? I ran across the street and gobbled a sandwich at the exchange buffet. I said hello to a friend of mine who was going upstairs to his office to blow his brains out. I bought the racing edition and stuck a carnation in my buttonhole. I had my shoes shined while answering telegrams and telephoning with the left hand. I bought a few thousand railroad stocks absent-mindedly and switched to Consolidated Gas on a hunch that the new pork barrel bill would improve the housewife's lot. I almost forgot to read the weather report. Fortunately, I had to run back to the cigar store to fill my breast pocket with a handful of Coronas. and that reminded me to look up the weather report to see if it had rained in the Ozark region. The tailor was listening to me goggle-eyed. "That's the truth," he said excitedly to the vice consul's wife, who had just made another bowl of soggy rice for me. And then suddenly it occurred to me that Lindbergh was coming back from Europe. I ran for the elevator and took the express to the 109th floor of a building that hadn't been built yet. I ran to the window and opened it. The street was choked with frantically cheering men, women, boys, girls, horse cops, motorcycle cops, ordinary cops, thieves, bulls, plainclothesmen, farmers, lawyers, acrobats, thugs, bank clerks, floor walkers, anything with pants or skirts on, anything that could cheer, holler, whistle, stamp, murder, or evaginate. Pigeons were flying through the canyon. It was Broadway. It was the year something or other, and our hero was returning from his great transcontinental flight. I stood at the window and cheered until I was hoarse. I don't believe in airplanes, but I cheered anyway. I took a drink of rye to clear my throat. I grabbed a telephone book. I tore it to pieces like a crazed hyena. I grabbed some ticker tape. I threw that down on the fly specks. Anaconda copper, amalgamated zinc, U.S. steel, 57.5, 34, 138, -2, +6 3/4, 51, going up, going higher, Atlantic coastline, seaboard airline. Here he comes, he's coming, that's him, that's Lindbergh. Hooray, hooray, some guy, the eagle of the sky, a hero, the greatest hero of all time. I took a mouthful of rice to quiet myself. "How high is the tallest building?" asked the vice consul. I looked at the tailor. "You answer it," I said. He guessed about 57 stories. I said, 142, not counting the flagpole. I stood up again to illustrate. Best way is to count the windows. The average skyscraper has roughly 92,546 windows back and front. I undid my belt and put it on again clumsily as if I were a window cleaner. I went to the window and sat on the sill outside. I cleaned the window thoroughly. I unhooked myself and went to the next window. I did that for 4.5 hours, making roughly 953 windows clean, scraped, and waterproof. "Doesn't it make you dizzy?" asked the tailor. "No, I'm used to it," I said. "I was a steeplejack once, after I quit the merchant tailoring business." I looked at the ceiling to see if I could do any demonstrating with the chandeliers. "You'd better eat your rice," said the vice consul's wife. I took another spoonful by way of politeness and absent-mindedly reached for the decanter in which there was the cognac. I was still excited about Lindbergh's homecoming. I forgot that actually, on that day when he landed at the Battery, I was digging a ditch for the park department in the county of Catawba. The commissioner was making a speech at a bowling club, a speech I had written for him the day before. The vice consul was completely at home now in the new world. He had forgotten about his contribution to life and letters. He was pouring me another drink. Had the gentleman tailor ever gone to a ball game? I inquired. He hadn't. Well, he surely must have heard of Christy Mathewson or Walter Johnson. He hadn't. Had he ever heard of a spitball? He hadn't. I threw the sofa cushions around on the parlor floor. First, second, third base, and home plate. I dusted the plate with the napkin. I put on my cage. I caught a fast one right over the plate. Strike. 2 more and he's out, I explained. I threw off the mask and ran toward the infield. I looked up through the roof and I saw the ball dropping out of the planet Pluto. I caught it with one hand and threw it to the shortstop. "He's out," I said. It was a fly. 3 more innings to go. How about a little popcorn? Have a bottle of pop, then. I took out a package of spearmint and I stuck a rib in my throat. "Always buy Wrigley's," I said. "It lasts longer. Besides, they spend $5,963 a year for advertising. Gives people work, keeps the subways clean." How about the Carnegie Library? Would you like to pay a visit to the library? 5,698,000 circulating subscribers. Every book thoroughly bound, filed, annotated, fumigated, and wrapped in cellophane. Andrew Carnegie gave it to the city of New York in memory of the Homestead riots. He was a poor boy who worked his way to the top. He never knew a day of joy. He was a very great millionaire who proved that it pays to work hard and save your pennies. He was wrong, but that doesn't make any difference. He's dead now, and he left us a chain of libraries which makes the working people more intelligent, more cultured, more informed. In short, more miserable and unhappy than they ever were, bless his heart. Let's go now to Grant's tomb. The tailor looked at his watch. It was getting late, he thought. I poured myself a nightcap, picked up the first, second, and third bases, and looked at the parrot, which was still awake because they had forgotten to put the hood over the cage. It's been a wonderful evening, I said, shaking hands all around, shaking hands with the maid, too, by mistake. You must come and see me when I get back to New York. I have a townhouse and a country house, you know. The weather is excellent in the fall when the smoke is cleared away. They're building a new dynamo over near Spuyten Duyvil. It runs by ether waves. The rice was excellent, too, tonight, and the cognac. Good night.